As someone who's had the opportunity to work with Prime Minister Modi for the last 8 years, it's a great honor to contribute to this volume. And what I have tried to do in the chapter which I have contributed is to really present my understanding of him in a set of contrasts. One is a contrast of a deeply nationalistic figure, someone who's almost driven by his desire to take India to a higher level. And the same nationalistic figure is actually very international, with an enormous curiosity about the world. So this nationalist-internationalist paradox that he represents is one part of it. The other, of course, is a leader who's very steeped in our history and culture, but who still realizes the promise of technology, who has a great belief in the power of science, who again uses one to reinforce the attractiveness and the strength of the other. So that's the second set of contrasts. The third, of course, is of a prime minister with a tremendous vision, a vision for India, for the world, but who translates that vision, who draws from the ground, who validates it every day from what is happening on the ground. So this unity of thought and action that he lives and actually uses for his policy making. And the fourth contrast is actually his way of working, where on the one hand, he develops a very detailed understanding of a situation, a challenge, a problem. So goes down to very, very deep detail. But when something is to be done, has great trust in his team members, delegates, backs them up fully, encourages them to work as a team. And therefore that knowledge of detail, yet the confidence to delegate. So that's the sense which I have of this Prime Minister with whom I have worked. And I also cite some of the examples of the last 8 years to demonstrate this. One of them is what happens when we go abroad, that everything he does, what he sees, what he assimilates, what he understands, all the time his mind is working on how do I take this and use it for the betterment of India. So you could say, our foreign visits in a way are continuous exercises in assessing, identifying, assessing, absorbing best practices and deploying it in India. The other part of it, of which also in a way I'm involved in implementing, is how do you develop capacities at home, new capabilities? How do you then deploy them abroad? Abroad for the good of India, abroad for the good of the world. So again, in a sense, this too is a contrast. I have, of course, got to know him much more closely after he became Prime Minister. I had met him for the first time when he was still Chief Minister. He had come to China. I mentioned my first encounter with him in China. But I've heard so much about his Gujarat days from him. And I see that having an influence on his thinking. Certainly, there are two very obvious examples. He was a very enthusiastic propagator of solar energy in Gujarat. Today, we see that reflected in the International Solar Alliance initiative. He led the earthquake reconstruction, their efforts there. And that we see today in the proposal for the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. So I can, you can actually see how the CM has shaped the PM that we have. But in all of this, I would say I'm very conscious as someone who's spent most of my life in foreign policy domain, that it is a domain where beliefs, ideas, concepts are very deeply entrenched. There's a very strong orthodoxy about foreign policy. And I find it very fascinating about Prime Minister Modi that he had both the ability, the determination, and in some ways the vision to challenge that orthodoxy. I mean, I begin with how he actually, at the first swearing in, the idea of getting all our neighboring leaders to India was itself was a departure from traditional diplomacy as we know it. So, in that sense, in the domain of foreign policy, it certainly was a breath of fresh air. And I think those who would go through the book would find different aspects of his ideas, his personality, his working style. Certainly, from the foreign policy perspective, the part which the world, in a sense, that I come from, I can say that it's been a very, very fascinating experience to work under his leadership, and I'm sure that the reader would agree with me when they go through that book.